Good afternoon and welcome to Older People. Covid-19 meets neoliberalism. This is a BASWA Heritage Project event in association with the Prof DE team at BASWA. And this is part of our anniversary events for the Heritage Project, focused on the last 50 years of the association and the impacts for the future. We've asked a panel of members to speak with us today about their experiences in regards to the subject matter and regarding the past, present and future of social work practice. So now I'm going to hand over to my colleague Sandra, who will be hosting the event today, and she'll tell you a little bit more about the subject, which is really close to her heart. So thank you very much for being here today, Sandra, and I'll leave everything with you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Gabby. Again, thanks again for joining our webinar. I'm Sandra Simpson and I'm a newly qualified social worker, currently completing my ASYE as an adult social worker. We're certainly living in some strange times. It's hard to believe that a year has passed and we're still living with the COVID-19 pandemic and lives are being lost daily. Older people play an important role in our society. They are the makers and the carriers of our history, our adored family members, our adored friends, neighbours, and above all, human beings. The COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the beauty of science, as we've seen with our vaccines, the kindness and strength that exists within humanity, but it has also exposed a litany of inequalities. Between the 2nd of March and 12th of June 2020, Amnesty International reported that 18,562 residents of care homes died with COVID-19. 40% of those people who died were aged 65 and over. In addition to the loss of life, older people have faced many human rights issues during this pandemic. For example, they've had to deal with blanket policies such as do not resuscitate. They've also had to worry about going into hospital out of fear of contracting coronavirus or not being seen, or the overburdening, the fear of feeling like they're overburdening the NHS service. I guess the question we need to be asking ourselves as a society, as social workers, as a social work profession, is how did it come to this? This webinar is essentially asking if the last 50 years of neoliberalism has impacted the response to COVID-19, and if so, what are we going to do about it? And what are our hopes for the future? Today I'm joined by 4 panellists with various backgrounds and experiences. We intend this session to be interactive, so please write your comments and questions in the box. I wish to also thank Gabriella and Amanda and BASNA's technical and support team for working behind the scenes and ensuring the smooth running of the webinar. The format will be that each speaker will speak for approximately 4 minutes and the remainder of the webinar will be for question and answers. Just to give a brief introduction for each of the panellists, our first speaker will be Dr. Ian Cummins, who qualified as a probation officer and subsequently as a mental health and adult social worker. Ian is a senior lecturer in social work at the University of Salford. We also have Michelle Janis, who trained as an immunologist. Michelle's recently decided to join the social work fold. Wishing you all the luck there, Michelle. Michelle volunteered in a care home throughout the pandemic and throughout the lockdown where there was a widespread coronavirus outbreak. She wrote about her experiences for the PSW magazine and also gave evidence for the Amnesty International inquiry titled As If Expendable, which investigated the treatment of care home residents in England during the lockdown. We then have Christian Kerr, who is a practitioner and lecturer in social work. He has been involved in supporting people with mental health issues, learning disabilities and traumatic brain injuries. Christian's research and writing interests include the reform of social work, social care and social work education. He is currently a resource review editor for Practice, Social Work in Action Journal, and was a member of the editorial collective for Social Work 2020 under COVID-19, which is a free online magazine. Last but not least, we have Peroska, who is originally from Hungary. She immigrated to the UK in 1978. She gained her first degree in humanities from Middlesex University and qualified in social work, children's social work, and her MSc in social policy and social work at the London School of Economics. Roscoe worked for 15 years in the mental health field, however, for the majority of the time has worked as a statutory social worker. Okay, so to lay the foundations down for the discussion about neoliberalism, I will begin with David Harvey's widely used definition of neoliberalism. So can we go to the next slide, please? So neoliberalism is in the first instance a theory of political economic practices that proposes that human well-being can best be advanced by liberating individual entrepreneurial freedoms and skills within the institutional framework characterised by strong private property rights, free market and free trade. It's worth stating that neoliberalism has various definitions. It can mean different things to different people. It has no political persuasion. It's been used in both communist regimes, socialist regimes, and authoritarian regimes. Now, if we can go on to the next slide. So basically on this slide, I've created a table really to demonstrate what neoliberalism looks like in practice in contrast with other welfare state models. The table has been taken from various sources, which I have referenced within the handouts. In terms of your current practice, I guess one of the questions we need to be asking ourselves is, where do we sit in these columns? Do you see anything wrong with neoliberalism? After all, we're entitled to right to private and family life. What is wrong with the minimalist state? What model sits well within social work practice, and what do you think? Now, enough of me. Let's get on to the panelists, because I'm sure that there's going to be some really interesting conversations. So starting off with Dr. Ian Cummins. So my first question to you would be, what have been your observations of neoliberalism during the Covid-19 pandemic?
Oh, thank you, Sandra. I think your introduction highlighted that neoliberalism, its emphasis on the market and the introduction of market practices, if you like, into all areas of life, including the welfare state. So in terms of COVID, one way of looking at the impact of any pandemic, health pandemic, is to see it as a test of governance, really. So it's a stress test for how these systems work. And actually what COVID has done, I would suggest, is expose the fault lines in the welfare state, or the what's happened under austerity and under neoliberalism is that there's been a huge reduction in welfare provision, and you can see that exposed in the response to COVID in two ways. One is that COVID has impacted disproportionately on poorer and marginalised groups, and inequality has increased dramatically under neoliberal regimes. Because the whole point of it is that there are winners and losers in a market. So you can see that also in attitudes to older people. At the start of COVID, the push for herd immunity essentially was saying that there are groups in society who have, to put it very crudely, as Jeremy Warner did in the Daily Telegraph, they've outlived their economic youthfulness, and therefore, you know, COVID is a kind of sorting out of the herd. And if we lose whatever number of people he suggested, then that's a price worth paying. So you can see there's those exposures. I think the other thing that strikes me is that there's been a pushback against it, actually, in terms of people have, they have acted in ways that would be seen as solidarity with others, in terms of individuals, in terms of supporting other people, community groups. There's been over 700,000 people volunteered, didn't they, at the start of the pandemic to help the I'm not quite sure what happened to those volunteers, but that's another matter. So I think in all these things, there's a importance of looking at trends, but also seeing that there's a pushback against them. And in terms of social work, I think that you can see that actually it's changed the way that social workers work because it changed the way that everybody works. And it's also, in some senses, raised social work values in terms of people having a view of community that might be different now. Now, there's not one way of looking at these things. Clearly, there are people who are saying, you know, open schools, get back to work, and so on. So I think the way to summarise my view, it would be that the pandemic has actually exposed the fault lines of neoliberalism. It highlights the way in which the emphasis on the reduction of the state leads to a marketisation. In fact, the state has had to intervene to support the market because of the pandemic. You can see the elements of that in the privatisation, contracting out, all those sorts of things are key elements of neoliberalism. But in terms of the social work response, there are different ways of working, there are different views going forward. And I don't think that there will be one response. In terms of social work practice, clearly there are huge issues around bereavement, around people's experience, around the burnout of workers that will form the basis of the response and how we respond in future.
Thank you, Ian. So Sandra, have you got your next panelist you'd like to speak to? Is that Michelle?
Yes, Michelle. So Michelle, could you tell me a little bit more about your experience during the pandemic working in the care home?
Yes, thanks, Sandra, and thanks for inviting me. So yes, just a bit of background. I was actually embedded within adult social care team when the pandemic struck, and as I was a student, I was removed from there. So I decided to volunteer within my local care home, and I actually did that very deliberately because I knew and suspected that they would be the group that they would be most neglected, and I was correct, I think, in that. I think what I saw during that time, I think the best way for me to describe is to give concrete examples of how I saw the sort of like the neoliberal project playing out. And the care home that I was in was actually, in some senses, very fortunate in that they managed to stave off COVID for a long time. But eventually, in the sort of early May, mid-May, it was noticed that some of the residents had symptoms. And one of the first things I noted was the manager, who I spent quite a lot of time with, actually spent one day 7 hours on the phone between Public Health England and Department of Health and Social Care, trying to arrange testing for those residents. So 7 hours of her time was spent essentially trying to negotiate of whose responsibility it was. So those 3 residents were tested, and those 3 only, and it was only after that it was found that they were all positive that there was mass testing done throughout the home. And on the area where I was working, 17 of the 23 residents came back positive by that stage, and most of the staff. And so by those delays, the outbreak had actually spread right throughout the home. In terms of social work in particular, because one could argue that, you know, the testing fiasco was outside of the social work remit, you know, there were lots of things going on in the home. There was, of course, the PPE pressures. There was staff stress. These care workers were really right on the front line there, and the isolation of residents, because the residents not only were unable to see any relatives, they were also unable to see each other, and they were trying to be confined into their rooms. And I wrote of my concerns back to the adult social care team, and basically saying, you know, there's a lot of pressure happening here. And I think probably for me the most disappointing response I've ever had from social work was the single line response back to a very lengthy email, which was that this is a concern for commissioning. Please take your concerns to them. And for me, all of a sudden, the social work project became a technocratic project, essentially. It became mired in bureaucracy. This is not my problem. This is commissioning. And I think for me, then, the third example that I wanted to give, and which involves social work, is, you know, within the stress of this, one of the residents broke her hip, and she didn't want to go to hospital because of her fear, and that's been mentioned already. And so there was real issues around safeguarding. And the managers at the home could not get a safeguarding team to engage. They could not get a visit out. The GP wouldn't come out to visit. And the only team that came out to visit was the local paramedics. And I wondered at that point about social work, because I'd seen a lot in social media and in the more general media about social workers being considered as frontline workers. And I really wondered at that point, what is a frontline worker, when we weren't prepared to enter into that arena? And actually, I was also concerned about the neglect of our sister profession, the frontline workers who were the care workers in there who were looking after these people. And so I really started to wonder about social work values and the effect that neoliberalism was having on the profession in terms of removing us from the core reason for perhaps for being social workers, and rather, you know, us becoming essentially technocrats. And that is my concern around this. And really, you know, I'd like this pandemic for us to reconsider what the role of the social worker is. So they're my examples, and as I said, I was a witness to the Amnesty International investigation, and also wrote about this for PSW magazine. So thank you very much.
Thank you. If we can move to Christian now.
So Christian, one of the questions I'd like to ask you really is, how has neoliberalism contributed towards social work response to the care crisis or Care Act easement? And, you know, how do you think we should respond in the future as social workers and the social work profession?
Thanks, Sandra. I'll try my best to cover those points, and thank you to Michelle for that testimony. And I know Michelle saw some bore witness to some very distressing things in her time there, which she touched on, but which were indeed showed the real human impact of what we're talking about today. I'll take a step back from that a little bit, and if we take privatisation, marketisation and commodification to be key signifiers of neoliberalism, and certainly they're the bits that people tend to think about at the mention of the word, then these things have certainly shaped social work's response to the crisis in care under the pandemic. And not least because they were already profoundly influencing the way that social work was practiced, even under normal circumstances. The Care Act, which is the main bit of legislation that pertains to the provision of care and support to adults in England, was introduced in austerity. In the context of marketisation, it was already entrained through the actions of successive governments, probably starting with Thatcher and coming through the Brown and Blair years and into the current administration. The Care Act presented a bold vision of individual choice and control and makes explicit reference to the market. And this idea of independence, choice and control, the entrepreneurial self that was alluded to in Sandra's slide, is a key feature of late capitalism, and of which it is argued neoliberalism is an outgrowth. And what has this meant for social work? Well, the focus is very much within adult social work, certainly on individuals having choice and control, living independent lives. And I'm not for 1 minute suggesting that these are bad things. That's a society we live in, and the trappings of which I enjoy every day. But these are cultural mores, and moreover, they're Western capitalist ones. So in social work, we are allocated a person to work with, and the model is by and large one of assess and identify an eligible need or needs, provide support, review that, and then withdraw. And there's an emphasis in local authority adult social work on efficiency, smart working, agile working. Terms like best value are bandied around a lot, and all of these are from the commercial playbook. We are corporatized to the extreme, we're in the grip of managerialism and proceduralism, which are designed to responsibilise workers, just as our current approach to care and support tends to responsibilise the people that we support, albeit under the guise of choice and control, which is a neoliberal a key expression of the neoliberal turn. So in a pandemic, when there's pressure on health services being transferred to the social care system, these things are amplified, compounded and hyper accelerated, resulting in pressure on care homes of the sort that Michelle witnessed, to take people from acute hospital settings. And care homes, being businesses under a neoliberal model, rely on revenue from commissioning bodies, and perhaps the smaller companies are particularly vulnerable, and so may be inclined to take risks with admissions from hospitals. And social workers are complicit in this. How many infectious people were placed in homes by social workers in the first wave? How many who weren't COVID positive, but who then contracted it as a result of going into a home? It's incredibly distressing to me to think about those people I have been involved with in the past who have ended up in care as a direct result of my work, albeit before the pandemic. But some of those people didn't want to be there. And thinking about my work on Section 12 deprivation of liberty appeals in the Court of Protection, there's been some of those cases. There's been no other viable, less restrictive option, but for that person to go into care against their will. And I think about those people a lot, and whether any of them might have succumbed to COVID as a result of that. So home care as well, and the practicalities of delivering care at home in a neoliberal society means that companies are driven by the need to make profit in a care market. This requires workers to visit multiple homes in a day, providing close quarters care to people who could conceivably be COVID positive. So how many people in receipt of care and support have been infected unwittingly by workers who are in good faith going about their jobs? This is not to blame those workers whose pay and conditions do not do justice to their contribution to society, nor is it to suggest that nationalised care would negate the issue, but it is the case that the squeeze on margins driven by LA budgets decimated by politically chosen austerity drives the phenomena of workers having to rush around homes, sometimes spending as little as a few minutes at a time with one person before going on to the next, and often seeing dozens of people in a day. As you can imagine, that was a scandalous situation even before the pandemic. On the easements, to my mind, they are a poignant expression of the above, designed to free up capacity in the system, again, language of commerce and corporatism, at the cost of people's rights. The fact that no LA has currently triggered the easements is not reassuring. Far from it. There is mounting evidence that LAs are cutting packages and denying support, including through intensified managerial pressure on individual workers to keep costs down in individual cases. And it's not unreasonable to ask whether the easements, at least in part, led to a permissive backdrop that emboldened local authorities to restrict people's legal rights with impunity. It must be okay because the DHSC, the Department of Health and Social Care, said so, that sort of thing. That is why it's so regrettable that the Joint Interim Chief Social Workers advised the Department of Health and Social Care to retain the easements as part of the winter plan for social care. So how should social work respond in the future? I mean, it sounds almost a cliche to talk about values, to talk about rights. Our duty as social workers, first and foremost, is to the person, the family, the group, or the community that we're working with and for. People are accused of being naive, I believe, and stuff like that these days. We're state actors, most often wielding the state's power, too often to people's detriment, I might add. But if you don't believe in your values, if you don't believe you're there to uphold people's rights, then who's going to be doing that if we're not? And it's absolutely right that ethical, compassionate, values-driven human beings backed by knowledge, research and theories drawn on in the service of others are at the nexus of care and control, mediating the power at the interface of care and the law. So what I'm saying there is social workers are, albeit they're agents of the state, and that's a problematic position to be in, but I'd rather a social worker was doing that than anyone else, and moreover a humane and compassionate social worker.
Thank you, Christian, and we'll come back to that point later. I think Sandra will want to come back to that, definitely. If we can move on to Piroska now, and I think Sandra has a question for you.
Yes, Piroska, we've obviously had some conversations in regards to you going back to the social work profession and leaving it, then coming back. And I just want to know a little bit about how you find it's changed, and has neoliberalism contributed towards that? Has it been amplified during the pandemic?
Hello, so my name is Pirashka Marcus, and Sandra introduced me earlier, but I think it's really important for me to be open about my age, because it does affect what I have experienced as a professional and also as a private person during 2020. So I'm going to be 65 next year, so I'm in the category which the kind of people who were supposed to be shielding and who the society was supposed to look after. And it's definitely not high experience. High experience is that my say and my status and my part in society has shifted from somebody who is just me to somebody who could be like a burden, or somebody who should be told by younger people what I should do and shouldn't do. And I'm quite a strong-minded person, and I don't think many people try to boss me around, but I have seen with friends that suddenly their children who are in their 30s or 40s suddenly felt that they can tell their mothers or fathers who are in their 60s or 70s that from now on they shouldn't leave their home, they shouldn't meet anybody, they shouldn't even exercise in case they die. And I just wanted to add that, because I think that kind of personal experience, partly through myself, partly through my friends, added to my passion about how I have experienced the situation of older people in England since March 2020. So as a professional, as a social worker, I was actually away in Central America when it all started. I came back and started to work again as a social worker at the end of June, and worked for 6 months in North London. Before that, I was traveling, but before that, I worked for about 3 years in Southeast London. And before that, for 10 years, I worked in the voluntary sector. And before that, I was a social worker on and off for about 15 years in mental health. And so from 91, when I qualified, until today, I worked on and off as a social worker, also worked in the voluntary sector. And because I had this 10 years gap between about 2006 and 2016, I can compare what social work used to be in the 90s and beginning of the millennium, and also the last few years. And when I came back to social work 4 years ago, I was absolutely shocked and horrified to discover what social work became. It was never ideal, it was never what it claimed to be, but suddenly it became, the social services became like an administrative empire, which has had departments dealing with brokerage and commissioning, and we started to use market language. And after a few months of completing endless forms on the computer system, which didn't seem to have any connection to the clients, or just artificial connection if you really pushed it, I realized that I became somebody who is as a social worker, who is helping to transfer public money to private hands. And my whole function was supposed to be offering services, but services meant anything people or somebody has to pay for. So the service of me establishing a trusting relationship with a client and with a dysfunctional family, and sorting out abuse or whatever between family members or other people, wasn't a service. The service was when I help a private company to get money either from the family or from social services, or sometimes from the health service, but a combination of all of this. That was the service I was supposed to arrange for people. And I realized that in this new function, the relationships between the social workers and the clients was almost in the way. Like, I actually have been told off for spending too much time with clients, trying to get to know them. Suddenly many things which was okay earlier became a no-go area. Like in the 90s, if I had a client, I took the client to day centers or care homes to help the client to choose. Now this time I had to be out of the picture, a brokerage section or whatever was doing some of those functions, and it became extremely fragmented. So on the computer system, I could see like 20 different people from the same department dealing with the same client, who had absolutely no idea who was who. So it became very fragmented and the relationship became non-important or even seen as negative. So what we have now in 2020, in my opinion, what we had is an extreme form of what was going wrong already. So because in 2017, I was already expected to spend about 80% of my time in front of a computer. Nobody, me and other social workers working with adults, I actually don't know about what's going on in children and families, but with adults and with elderly people, we were supposed to be completing these forms in front of a computer system, being accountable to the computer system itself. The dates of when we have to do things being determined by the computer system. So that became an extreme way of engaging with a computer system in 2020, when large majority of social workers I know, or let's say at least 50%, haven't even left their home. They may have had good medical reasons or whatever. I insisted to go to see my clients at least once, because otherwise I just don't know who is the person. But I had to get special permission for that, and I think I was seen more like a extreme case of person who is insisting to go out and putting herself at risk or whatever. But the usual thing was you work from at home, and if you don't really fight for it, you don't have to see the client. So you're making decisions about people going to care homes or coming out of care homes, or this many hours of care or whatever, or even safeguarding a mental capacity without seeing the people on the basis of a phone call or a video interview, or on the basis of other reports. And I think this is really, really unfair to the clients. My fear is that because it kind of works, it's cheaper or whatever, it's efficient, it may be the future model of social work. And where we have to go in the future, I think to some degree is going back to the past. And I'm the last person who would say that everything was all right in the past, but many, many things were much better. That was the relationship you were supposed to establish was important. You were given skills. You may have learned some counseling skills, family therapy skills, and that was all part of social work. Even community work was part of social work. And we have to some degree, we have to go back. We can keep some of the good things, but I can't think of many good things from the last few years.
Thank you, Piroshka. Thank you so much. And we'll come back to a lot of these points. If we could just go back to Ian's question. I believe there was a second question for Ian that has we've actually sort of looked at some of that within the other discussions. And I think it would be nice to go back to that point about resistance.
Absolutely. So in terms of, in your concluding chapters, Ian, in your book titled Poverty, Inequality and Social Work, you talk about resistance, and I just want to understand a little bit more about what we can do, and what do you feel, in your opinion, social workers can do to resist neoliberalism?
Well, thanks for the plug for the book there, Sandra. I understand it's available at all good bookshops if they're still running. Really, I think there is. This is it comes from what Piroshka was saying, really, in that the pandemic has actually exposed the flaws, developments that BASWA and all social workers are well aware of this move to a very functionalist, managerialist approach. And actually, one of the things that I think in terms of resistance is to challenge some of the things that Christian were talking about. So the language of choice, the language of rights. Yes, we're all in favor of choice, but actually, what does that mean? I can give you a very personal example. My late mother attended a day centre in Coventry. The hours were cut because of cuts from Coventry Social's budget, etc., etc. She received a letter. She was in her 80s at the time and suffered from Alzheimer's. She really received a letter saying, you know, she could go if she could make arrangements to go, and this was presented as a choice. She had no choice at all. You know, the choice was for the family, and when we use the term family, we always mean women, don't we? Really. To make new arrangements and so on. So I think the language of choice and individualism, I'm in favour of choice, of course I am, but let's talk about it in a much more sophisticated and actually a realistic way. And it's very easy to use the language of rights to deny people rights. That's what the Care Act and other legislation does. So that's one element of resistance. And the resistance is on two levels, I think. Organisationally, and social workers, frankly, I'm not a practicing social worker, but as an outsider, if I can use that term, I think organisationally and senior figures in social work have let the profession down, to be frank, in terms of their responses to some of the government initiatives and so on, particularly in children's services. So in terms of a profession, social work is in a classic, it's a classic dilemma. It faces two ways at once, in that it works with individuals, but it also restricts those individuals' choices, rights, and so on. So you can't, there's a kind of council of despair that says all this will, because neoliberalism, because power of modern capitalism, which we're seeing here using these Zoom, etc., etc. So individual social workers can't resist that. But what they can do is do the sorts of things that Piroska was talking about in terms of working with individuals. And in terms specifically in the pandemic, I think one of the most important things will be the memory of the pandemic and the testimony that Michelle has given and other people have given is going to be vital, because the danger is, I think, politically and also in a kind of societal way, is that the vaccine will roll out and we'll forget what happened. Now, individuals won't forget, but there will be yes, everything's fine now, we've survived, etc., etc., and we will not go back. And social work can highlight these testimonies, because that's when I trained as a social worker. Actually, that's what a lot of social work was about. It was about people's life story work almost, and looking at how that impacts on individuals. So, in terms of resistance, you have to be optimistic, otherwise you won't be a social worker. And I think you can resist in two ways. You can resist organisationally, but also you can resist on a daily level in terms of the way that individuals work with individual people. I was an approved social worker, so I detained people and assessed people who were then detained under the Mental Health Act. Clearly that removed their rights, removed their liberty, but hopefully I treated those people with dignity and respect during that process. And there's lots of evidence that from research that shows that if you do that, whatever the outcome of the decision, people still value that process. So it's, I think in terms of how we go on from this, I think the danger is we'll just go back to what it was before, but slightly different. And I think there's a really important point for social workers to get the experience, to get the testimonies of staff, but also service users into the public domain much more. People don't know, or didn't know before the pandemic, how care homes worked, what it was like in a care home, because they're hidden from society. So that's my point to take on to the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Ian. Thank you. And I think that leads us very well into the Q&A now. And we're going to be taking some questions from audience and panelists alike, and something has already come through. I know we've already had a question through, and I can read that out if you're happy for me to do that. And this is obviously addressed to all panelists, and whoever wants to answer this can. What is your view on social workers being responsible for following up on client debt with service users? In my last post, we were asked to meet with clients and families to discuss debts and contributions to their care. So what? And this person's talking about research in regards to impact of the therapeutic relationship with clients. So I'll just open that out to the panel.
I would say personally that I don't feel it is the role for us to be chasing debts. That's not social work. I do not consider that to be social work, and it puts us in a conflicting role. It really does. It puts us in a conflicting role in terms of the power dynamic. You know, we are not debt collectors. So that's my personal view.
I would agree with Sandra there. I think we do have conversations with the people that we support about money, often from the outset when approaching people with an assessment under the Care Act, where you haven't to explain to them the chargeable nature of Care Act support. So that's one thing, and I think that's a conversation you can have you're letting people know what their rights are and what they can expect. And I'm less uncomfortable with that than I am with the sort of thing that's been suggested here, which is when you're asked to get involved in these very difficult conversations about people who haven't paid the contributions and stuff like that, because that does indeed have a huge impact on the therapeutic relationship. I interface a lot with deputyship teams and corporate deputyship and corporate appointeeship teams in local authorities. I'm always a bit uneasy around that as well. The level to which I'm expected to be embroiled in a person's individual finances, I feel that again can lead to conflict between me and the person. And I should actually be there to support them to actually communicate with these departments, but more often than not, the department expects you to be the face of the local authority for whatever the local authority wants you to do, and that has huge implications. So, yeah, I would agree that it's highly problematic to be talking to service users about debt for that reason.
Thank you very much for that, Christian. I think we've got another question that's come through. I can see that here. This person's asking, has neoliberalism during the pandemic taken us back to the days of institutions? And how do we come back from this?
Can I answer?
Yes, of course, Paraska. Thank you.
Okay, so it was actually another thing that I wanted to mention, that the team I worked for in North London was a really good team, and we had exceptionally good management, I would say. But what I have experienced, and what I'm sure they have experienced, is that lots of the instructions were coming from somewhere above. I don't know where from, but in contrast to my previous experience as a social worker in the 90s and early 2000s, I suddenly found myself following instructions or fighting against instructions, and I think my managers were in the same position. And I don't quite know if the instructions came from the government or not. So one day we would just get an instruction that you need to send everybody who is COVID positive or COVID negative or whatever to this and that care homes if it looks like they meet the eligible criteria, if they can't go home. And in the past, there would have been a long process of establishing, is it what they need, and And one of the reasons why it was so easy to send people to care homes, and I don't think people recognize that to the public, is that the government was paying. So there was this COVID funding. You didn't have to go through the process of finding out, does the family have money, does the person have money, do they meet the criteria, Suddenly there was all this money there. And I think with that, these institutionalized solutions were thrown in, and you were more or less told as a social worker what you're supposed to do in this process, which is very far from how we used to work 20-30 years ago, that an institutionalized solution was seen as one of the worst solutions. And although people think that nowadays they are giving choice, no, even with community care, we were supposed to find community solutions, but it was never free, and suddenly it became free. And it was used as a block, a kind of solution for almost everybody. And you are just somebody who is doing the administration of it.
Thank you very much, Oscar. Thank you. And if we move on to Michelle, because I think she's got a comment as well.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks. Actually, I concur with Paraska, but also I was thinking about this issue of institutionalization from my own experiences. And there are a couple of things. I mean, absolutely what I saw was when I was working in the care home is real isolation of the people in there. And even before COVID hit, the kind of really rapid decline of a lot of the residents there because they were so isolated. And I appreciate this really was a very, very difficult situation because on the one hand we had an unknown virus, we're trying to protect people, but the consequences of that isolation as well, I think, really need to be acknowledged. And on the matter of what we've been talking about these issues of choice, I mean, again, I'm going to illustrate with another personal example. The youngest resident of the care home where I was working was 64, and she did have high care needs, which was why she was there. But I spent quite a lot of time with her, and she was very fearful. She was very aware of what was happening, and she told me on a number of occasions that she didn't want to be there, that she wanted her own place outside of there. She was in an institution, and she was very worried about how transmissible the virus was. Now, she died, actually. She died. She contracted COVID, and she died. And she couldn't see her children, and she couldn't see her grandchildren. And she didn't want to be there. She asked not to be there. And this is not choice. And this was isolation. So this is just, it's another testament about this whole facade, what I think about this sort of giving people choice. So, thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. And if we could move to Ian now.
Yep, I just wanted to make the comment about the institutions. One of the differences, I think, is that families and carers have actually raised the issue of not being able to visit their relatives in care homes. So a lot of the publicity has come from people who have been denied access to see their relatives, and that didn't happen in institutions. So this is another example, I think, of possible resistance, in the sense that there is an alliance. There's a huge potential alliance there between groups like John's campaign around hospital visiting for people who have dementia and so on. So I think there's a shift, there is a danger, but actually the pandemic perhaps has put care homes into a debate, a public domain that they weren't before. And, who knows when the public inquiry will take place, but there's potential there to raise these issues, to raise the issues that Michelle, Christian and Piroska have been talking around choice, around the daily routine in care homes. I have a friend who's in a residential care home we haven't been able to visit, but actually my concern has been about the level of care that he has been receiving, because I know that from our visits, regular visits, we were pointing out gaps in the care. So, there's a concern here. I think that there's potential here to expose the failings of that system. And clearly, I'm not being critical of individual workers at all, because the other organisational stress that's been revealed here is around employment conditions, around the pressures that people face, the issues that Christian raised around home visits and, poorly paid, poorly trained people being asked to take on a huge responsibility.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And I think we've got time for a final question, and it's quite a good one in regards to impacts for the future. I think it's a follow-up to the points that have been discussed. This person's asking, I'd like to hear the panel's reflections on how social workers can work positively and helpfully with care home residents, families and staff. I suppose that's moving forward, and it's a future question, and so that's directed to everyone.
Could I answer quickly? I'm sure the panelists have all got different solutions, but one of the one of the proposals that I put forward, and I think that Basil has taken it forward now, is it's an easy solution, but also just thinking creatively. So under normal circumstances, when social workers get involved with care homes, you go and see an individual resident, and so that means within the individual social worker will go to multiple care homes, which is obviously an infection risk. And a very easy solution to this is to have a named social worker for the whole care home. But then you've got a single worker, and once they get integrated into their regular testing system, which the care homes now have in place, weekly testing system, that's your point of contact. Now the social worker can go in there. They're a pair of eyes, they're a pair of ears, but it doesn't take very much in terms of an organizational change, in terms of creative thinking, to go from sort of like the one social worker, multiple care homes, to one social worker, one care home each. That's not difficult, but I think that that's a very easy solution. We just need to think a little more creatively. I'm sure the panelists have got other solutions.
Can I? Yeah.
Of course.
I remember when I worked a few years ago in one of the local authorities, one of my managers came up with a really, really excellent idea, and that was before COVID. And what he was saying that when a member of a family moves into a care home, the family experiences it, or quite often they experience it as a bereavement. And we could run like a group support, group therapy session for family members who had this experience. And that made me think about my individual work. And I have worked with people, and I supported adults who may be in their 50s, 60s, who make a very difficult decision to place their mother or father in a care home, of how important is it to understand the whole system, the whole family, the dynamics. Sometimes people don't agree with each other, and to not to push them to make a decision too early. And I know that in 2020, many people were put in care homes from one minute to another one, and the family had very little choice, if any. But when there is a possibility of working with the family, when the old person is still at home and the family is unsure if they want to make the decision or not, or even if they should, to offer counseling, offer support, offer to be there for them, and don't push them to make the decision, because it's not an easy one, and people will always feel ambivalent about it. And once the person is in it, offer support again. It's not like the person moved in the care home, that's it, end of the day, you can close this case and you move on to the next person. It's a long, difficult process. As a social workers, we should recognize that.
I think there's lots of different strands to that answer, I think. But if I was to focus on practice for a minute, because I tend to think about bigger things, but if I'm thinking about my practice, then I would suggest that social workers should take, and this might align with what's been suggested by Michelle and Piroska as well. In our practice with older people in care homes, we should, in my view, and this is something that's been an interest of mine for a long time, and something I developed, started an interest in as a student in a care home a long time ago, is if you take a life story approach to people, rather than seeing them as a set of needs. So I'm not suggesting if you can do a bit of life story work, an extended, dedicated piece of work with people, I mean, I would highly recommend any social worker does that work if they can. But if your approach to an assessment is to learn about that person's life, to learn about the history, to learn about who they are, and to present that within your assessment, and to present that to your organization as this isn't a person, this is a person, not a set of needs. It's much easier to advocate, and it's much easier to get favorable responses from organizations if you are saying that this is a person, really. And yeah, so I'm a big advocate of taking a life story approach to all assessments, particularly with older people in care homes whose identities are under assault by their very presence in a care home, which is homogenizing and also often in the context of cognitive progressive illnesses where people's identities are threatened as well. So yeah, just be interested in people and make that interest something that's part of your practice.
Yeah, I just wanted to, it follows on from that actually, Christian. At the beginning of the pandemic, and certainly later in the second, when ICUs were preparing for second wave, there was a lot of coverage about what, essentially about, it wasn't phrased in this term, but it was about what constitutes a good death and how we cope with bereavement and how we say goodbye to our loved ones. And I think there is something here about the social work role and the technocratic approaches that have taken that away. So there was a lot of coverage, for example, of ICU staff phoning relatives and using iPads and all this sort of thing. And you're thinking, well, actually, there's positives to that clearly, but it was introduced. Why we need to think about these very end of life issues, and certainly when I trained, which is a long time ago, I trained so long ago that prevention officers qualified as social workers, that grief, bereavement and loss were key elements of social work training. And I think one of the shifts to managerialism is to remove those sorts of approaches, because clearly it's all about brokerage. It's all about, we don't talk to people about their feelings. We organise, care packages don't have a section that says somebody will talk to me about my feelings. My friend who's in a care home has got a progressive illness. As far as I'm aware, nobody has ever spoken to him about that.
Thank you. And now I think we're going to end with Sandra's comments. Thank you to all panelists for today. It's been wonderful and so much wonderful discussion. I'm sure the audience will have some further questions, and if you do, please contact us on the email address on the slides, and the slides are all available for you to download now.
Yeah, I think what's clear from all the panelists is the importance of relationships and humanising people, because what we're talking about here is actually dehumanisation. So connecting together, collective action is incredibly important now going forward. So I encourage everyone to connect as social work practitioners and to continue just having these conversations. Don't let this be, one of many webinars this year. Let's keep going, have these conversations with your colleagues. It's important to connect, and that's it.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much for the panelists, really. I should say that. Thank you so much for the panelists. I do apologise.
Thank you for everyone that's attended today, and thank you, Sandra, for putting it all together. We look forward to doing future webinars in hopefully moving forward this year, and there's lots more we can talk about around the subject. Thank you all.